But in any case, I'll be expanding on this topic more in part 2, where we'll be talking about music. See you then.
4 to 6 weeks later.
And if you're anticipating part 2, and I'm looking forward to it too, I regret to inform you that it's going to take a lot longer than I anticipated. I am working on it as we speak, but as I keep working on it, I just realize that, there's just a lot that I need to cover in that video. And given that there's some stuff that I still need to write, and voiceovers I need to record, and footage I need to collect, and all the things to edit, and given the fact that I'll be out of town for most of August, it's just going to take a lot longer than I expected to put that video together and have it out for you all.
Several months later. One eternity later.
We're back!
Welcome back one and all to part 2 of this 3-part essay on Fire Emblem 3 Houses and a big, scary German word. As I alluded to at the end of part 1, music is going to be our main focus today. And while I did talk a bit about music early on in part 1, I made a shocking realization in the later stages of making that video. I was editing audio for a video which I had already finished the script and recorded all the voiceovers, covering topics relating to Wagner and opera and Gesamtkunstwerk, and yet I failed to talk about perhaps the most iconic aspect of Wagnerian opera. And so that's the story of this video. The entirety of part 2 is meant to atone for that grave mistake. So what is this thing of which I speak that's so important that I have to devote an entire video to it? If you can believe it, it's actually another big scary German music word, which I promise was not planned. And what is this other big scary German word? The Light Motif. You may not know this word, but I guarantee you come across it in the media you consume. It's those little recurring musical figures that represent different characters and objects and such in movies and other media. As you hear these motifs, or themes as they're sometimes referred to, you typically hear it change slightly over time, reflecting the development of its corresponding character or idea throughout the narrative. Think of Star Wars, for example. One of the best known examples of the Light Motif is Darth Vader's theme, which at times shows Darth Vader in a position of power, of inducing fear,
Lord Vader, the fleet has moved out to flight speed and we're preparing to...
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral. Captain Piet.
Yes, my lord.
Make ready to land our troops beyond their energy field, then deploy the fleet so that nothing gets off the system.
of vulnerability, and so on. Plenty of other characters in Star Wars get the Light Motif treatment too, as do characters and even objects in other films, but I'll let you do your own homework on that if you're interested. But anyways, after my aforementioned stunning realization, I also realized that Fire Emblem 3 Houses is a perfect vehicle for discussing the concept of the Light Motif, as the majority of this soundtrack is very motifically driven. Of course, the music is fantastic in general as well, but come on. Saying that a Fire Emblem game has good music is like saying that fish swim in water. So that's what we'll be discussing today. Buckle up, because it's going to be a wild ride. But before we start, I'll take this moment to give a few caveats. First, although I am a singer and composer by trade, if you couldn't already tell, I won't be getting too in-depth on the strictly musical aspects of the tracks I'll be discussing, except for when I really think it's necessary. Instead, I'll be focusing on the role the music plays on the story and characters as they develop. I suppose I could make a music theory type analysis on a track or two if y'all really want. Let me know in the comments, why not? but that would be for another time. Second, and this should go without saying, but I will be making a lot of very subjective statements throughout this essay. Feel free to let me know in the comments if your perspective on these things differs from mine. I'd love to hear what all of you have to say. Third, and I'm inserting this caveat as I'm neck deep into writing the script of this video, but this will not be an exhaustive look at the ideas I'll be talking about. That would just take too long, and it would push me too far beyond my ability to put a video like this together, considering my still novice status in the art of video crafting. Instead, think of this as a general overview of the leitmotif in action in this single piece of media. And speaking of novice status, I'll also go ahead and apologize in advance for some of the jarring editing that will be coming. I'll be swapping between music clips as I talk about them, which I know goes against what I said about music swapping in part 1, but for the purposes of this video, I think it's going to be necessary. And finally, I want you all to know that I will not be holding back on spoilers. It's kind of hard to talk about developing motifs without also talking about what's happening in crucial parts of the story. I'll give you a few seconds to click off this video if that bothers you. I completely understand if it does. Alright, with that out of the way, let's begin. There are a few motifs I want to focus on, specifically 4 of them, plus 4 half motifs. I'll explain those once we get there. And of course, we're going to start with It's hard for me to describe just how much I love The Edge of Dawn, both as a song in general and as an encapsulation of the larger ideas at play throughout this game. The song is sung from Edelgard's perspective, hence why you might know it simply as Edelgard's theme, with the implication that she's singing or expressing it while studying at the academy during White Clouds, portraying her internal struggle between the present, that is, her desire to hold on to her present joy and innocence with her peers at the academy, and the future, that is, her more solemn sense of duty to carve a path to a better, more enlightened future, even if it means war and bloodshed. And within the larger Edge of Dawn motif are 2, let's call them sub-motifs. These are not the half motifs I mentioned earlier. We'll get to those later. And the first of these sub-motifs is
reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. No, I wish I could stay here in cherished halls, in peaceful days. I fear the edge of dawn, knowing time betrays.
And the second is
Great lights pass through colored glass in this beloved place. Silver shines, the world dines, a smile on each face. As joy surrounds, comfort abounds, and I can feel I'm breaking free. For just this moment lost in time, I am finally me.
both of these sub-motifs are absolutely littered throughout the game. In fact, given how pervasive the Edge of Dawn is throughout this whole game, regardless of route, you could easily make the case that Edelgard's internal struggle is the central focal point of the game at large, and that it is the main conflict of the game. Not the war itself, not those who slither in the dark versus the church, not even Edelgard versus the church, but Edelgard versus herself. All other conflicts in this game, whether internal or external, either run parallel to or are mere outcroppings of Edelgard's struggle, and the sheer amount of times you hear moments from the Edge of Dawn throughout this game reflects that. Even in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, though Edelgard dies before the final 2 chapters, her struggle still serves as a catalyst for the return of Nemesis in Verdant Wind, and Rhea's devolving into the rampaging Immaculate One in Silver Snow. And before we continue, I've actually compiled a list of all the tracks where the Edge of Dawn shows up, which I'll show here for you all to pause and browse at your leisure. I hope you enjoy it, because it took me a lot longer than I care to admit to compile this list. For time's sake, I won't talk about every single one of these examples. Instead, I'll highlight just a few of these so we can catch a glimpse of how the music reflects the changes happening throughout the narrative. Long before any of us had a chance to play Three Houses, we were already introduced to this motif during the game's promotional stage, showing up in a trailer Nintendo showed us during Nintendo E3 2018.
Such a brutal, irrational world we live in. Some believe the Crests, tokens of the goddess's power are necessary to maintain order. But they're wrong, teacher. The Crests are to blame.
Considering this initial iteration of the motif also includes the text to the first chorus as well as a monologue from Edelgard, Nintendo and the developers were already cluing us into the main ideas behind this motif, mentally preparing the players for the upcoming game. But let's fast forward to when we actually could play it. In-game, we first hear the Edge of Dawn in that fleeting moment in Fodlan Winds during your first battle with Geralt, Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude. It's just enough to get the melodic figure in our minds, but not enough to draw too much attention to itself. After, we hear it a few times in more obvious fashion and in fairly quick succession. First, when Alois introduces himself.
Oh, it must have been 20 years ago that you went missing without a trace. I always knew you were still alive.
Then when you arrive at the monastery and see the montage featuring Hanneman and Manuela. And also the montage on your first day as a professor, which features all the students of the three houses. Keep in mind, this is all before we even get a chance to explore the monastery for the first time. We've barely even had a chance to play the game, and the motif has already been drilled into our heads. We then continue to the White Clouds portion of the game, during which the iterations of the Edge of Dawn generally evoke happy or otherwise positive emotions, reflecting the positivity of the academic year and the high hopes of each student. It's relaxed in life at Garrigmach Monastery. It's joyful in Fodlan Winds. And it's reverent at the cathedral. Before the Battle of the Eagle and Lion, the motif takes on a regal feel in the trumpet fanfare. And it returns after you and your class emerge victorious.
Oh, me too! I have so much to tell you! And I want to thank you too.
Honestly, Professor, I was only able to achieve so much because you were with us.
Ash is right. You're irreplaceable to us, Professor.
Yes, that! Without you...
Before the ball, the motif plays when you and your class promise to return to the monastery for the Millennium Festival.
5 years from now, you'll all have your own stuffy positions to contend with. But as I understand it, the festivities at the Millennium Festival will be of a scale far beyond anything we've yet seen. In other words, the perfect excuse for all of us to return here.
Ooh, a reunion? That sounds...
I also noticed at one point that Bernadetta even hums it in her C support with Yuri.
Is that Yuri?
It's not all sunshine and rainbows though. The motif gives off a sense of worry in the track Tactics, which plays during the month in which you must search for Flayn, who has gone missing. It also gives us our first taste of sorrow in the track Broken Routine after the death of Geralt. And in the following battle in the Sealed Forest, it shows up in the energetic Tearing Through Heaven as Byleth and company move to avenge Geralt. Tearing Through Heaven also shows up in the prior battles at Ramire Village and at the chapel, providing a similar sense of urgency. As we approach the end of White Clouds, the Edge of Dawn shows up during the battle for Garreg Mach before the time skip, providing a backdrop to the grim and sudden beginning of war. As well as the cutscene after, where Byleth disappears amidst the chaos of battle. Then, when Byleth wakes up after 5 years of slumber, the Edge of Dawn shows up multiple times in quick succession, much like at the beginning of the game, this time when talking to the villager, when you see your class again, etc. The one example I'll focus on here is when you first reunite with Edelgard, Claude, or Dimitri depending on route. The track Unfulfilled plays, reflecting the bittersweetness of seeing your house leader again. You're happy to see them, but there's little to celebrate with the war raging.
Huh? It's you! What are you doing here? For me? Highly doubtful. So you were alive. What have you been doing all this time? Choking at a time like this. Well, if you don't wish to tell me, I won't try to persuade you. All that matters is this.
It's also interesting to note here that the scene only truly lives up to the unfulfilled name in Silver Snow, where although you reunite with Edelgard, she cannot remain with you like your house leader can in the other 3 routes. We then progress into the second half of the game, and the motif returns time and again in much different context from what we hear in White Clouds. When roaming the monastery, the relaxed life at Garreg Mach Monastery is replaced with the more determined scales of the goddess. Later, the Edge of Dawn recalls bittersweet memories during the second battle at Gronder Field, as all the students reunite on the battlefield as enemies. The motif then takes on a darker tone of war and struggle during the Long Road, which either plays when you're attacking Enbar or fighting in the Tailtean Plains, depending on the route. Unfulfilled makes a sorrowful return either as you end Edelgard's pursuit of a new world by killing her, or as Edelgard secures Dimitri's defeat by killing him, which, while putting Edelgard one step closer to achieving her goal, requires the death of a childhood friend by her own hand.
Your obsession with me is appalling. If you were a normal human, you would most certainly have died already. Farewell, King of Delusion.
The motif also sets the stage for the climactic battle in Azure Moon and Crimson Flower in the apex of the world, and it even makes an appearance in the climactic track of Silver Snow, A Funeral of Flowers, though I'll be discussing that in more detail after I address some of the other motifs. In Crimson Flower and Verdant Wind, the motif appears immediately after defeating the final boss via A World for Humanity and A New Dawn, as you defeat either the Immaculate One or Nemesis once and for all, capturing the triumphant moment when the war finally ends.
You are all pathetic weaklings. You lack the courage to challenge me in lone combat.
Yet we have the strength to scale the walls between us, to reach out our hands in friendship so we can open our true hearts to one another. That's how we win!
And of course, after you beat the game and you go through the final cutscenes and S-support conversation and see what each character does after the story ends, where the motif also shows up, you hear the Edge of Dawn one last time in the credits, either in the melancholic self-titled song after Azure Moon, Verdant Wind, and Silver Snow, i.e. if Edelgard dies, or in the cathartic The Color of Sunrise after Crimson Flower, i.e. if Edelgard succeeds. And the fact that one version is sung and the other is instrumental is no accident. The lack of text in The Color of Sunrise indicates not only that Edelgard has achieved everything she set out to do, but she also no longer has to cling to that long-lost innocence from her academy days. And the motif shows up one last time later in the credits, you know, just in case you missed it all those other times. So to recap, just as Edelgard's struggle dominates the trajectory of this game's story, The Edge of Dawn permeates this soundtrack in a way that connects the narrative to the larger ideas at play. Oh, but one more thing before we move on. If you get the DLC, you can hear the Edge of Dawn motif inverted in The Forgotten and At What Cost. It shows up in retrograde during the Shackled Wolves. Just a fun little tidbit I thought you might enjoy. Alright, so now that we've discussed Edelgard's theme, let's talk about the motif representing her diametric opposite. Our second motif is Song of the Nabateans, which you might just think of as Rhea's theme. It's a song that is heavily implied to have been sung to Rhea by Sothis, and reflects Rhea's intense desire to bring her mother back to the world after a millennium of absence. Through this lens, we can see that while The Edge of Dawn concerns itself with the present and future, Song of the Nabateans focuses almost entirely on the past. And while Song of the Nabateans doesn't receive as much playtime as The Edge of Dawn, it nonetheless serves as a direct parallel to The Edge of Dawn and helps set the plot into motion. Once again, I have a list of all the tracks that feature the Song of the Nabateans motif here. We're introduced to this motif when Byleth introduces themselves to Rhea via the Guardian of Starlight track, as well as the following conversation between Rhea and Seteth, where Seteth questions Rhea's decision to make Byleth a professor.
Forgive my silence all these years. Much has happened since we last spoke.
So I see. The miracle of fatherhood has blessed you. That is your child, is it not?
Yes. Born many years.
Here, the motif establishes itself as serene and even mystical, reflecting our first impression of Rhea as a beautiful, wise, and caring leader, but with a touch of mystery provided by Seteth's questioning and Gerald's reluctance to rejoin the Knights of Seiros. On the surface, most early appearances of the Song of the Nabateans motif during White Cloud seem mundane, as it usually appears via the Guardian of Starlight track at the beginning of each month when Rhea briefs the player on the upcoming mission. But we still experience a few moments of development, most notably via the Gazing at Sirius track, particularly at the end of the first mission in Xanadu, where Byleth and Sothis remark how familiar the Red Canyon feels.
I wonder why it is that you recall this place.
Here, the motif maintains the mystical feel of Guardian of Starlight, but this time it feels off, as though there's some unanswered question with a resolution that lies out of reach. Likewise, Gazing at Sirius plays after the chapter at the Holy Mausoleum, when Rhea sentences the members of the Western Church to death.
Monster! We know you've already slaughtered many of our fellow brethren like this.
This concludes the investigation. Please remove these poor lost souls from my sight.
Not only does the motif feel off, but it accompanies the first time the player sees the dark side of the church, calling into question the morality of the church's actions. We aren't introduced to the full, unadulterated version of Song of the Nabateans until the night of the ball, when Byleth and Sothis follow Rhea, who sings it into the night, featuring one of the most gorgeous art stills in the game. Paired with the visual, this unambiguous statement of the motif gives it a celestial, otherworldly feel, as though time is stopped. The instrumental section that follows the song melody also helps emphasize this as we linger on the still image. And of course, we learn in this scene that Sothis wrote the song, adding more complexity to the connection between Rhea and Byleth and Sothis. Rhea sings the motif again after Byleth merges with Sothis, this time in a much more intimate setting where Byleth regains consciousness with their head in Rhea's lap.
In time's flow, see the glow of flames ever burning bright on the swift rivers drift, broken memories alight.
It's one of the few moments in the game where we see Rhea allow herself to express true contentment, wishing for the moment to last forever, adding a layer of hope to Rhea's desire for the return of Sothis. Story-wise, it's this intimacy that sets up the emotional weight of the following chapter, where you must choose whether to side with Rhea against Imperial aggression, or betray her by siding with Edelgard. And speaking of that decision, the motif shows up again via Gazing at Sirius in the beginning of the mission at the Holy Tomb, when Rhea attempts to begin the ceremony before the Imperial army shows up.
This is where the goddess who created this world was laid to rest, along with her children. It is said that our creator, the goddess Sothis, sat upon this very throne. Professor, do you recognize this throne?
Once again, this iteration of the motif feels off, which makes sense given that the fact that nothing happens when Byleth sits on the throne is paired with the impending arrival of the Imperial army to disrupt the ceremony. Gazing at Sirius shows up again in the non-Crimson Flower routes when Seteth asks Rhea if Byleth is the progenitor god, i.e. Sothis, as well as in all routes where Seteth asks Rhea what she did to Byleth as an infant. Here, the motif reflects the troubling nature of Rhea's secrecy in her methodology for bringing Sothis back. After the battle at Garreg Mach in the non-Crimson Flower routes, we hear the Song of the Nabateans melody as we witness Rhea transform into the Immaculate One for the first time, which serves as a pretty neat character reveal.
No, I will not allow another Red Canyon tragedy to happen here.
Additionally, the key and instrumentation here serve as foreshadowing for what we'll hear in A Funeral of Flowers. We'll get there soon enough. The use of the Song of the Nabateans motif in the second half of the game varies depending on the route. In Azure Moon, Verdant Wind, and Silver Snow, we of course hear the motif in Rhea's paralogue. In Crimson Flower, it shows up when Catherine reports to Rhea that you have defeated Seteth and Flayn, as well as in other similar moments throughout the campaign.
Make a clean sweep of those who came to attack us. The unit that invaded the monastery has been completely driven away. A bitter disappointment. I fear we can do nothing but retreat for now.
Seteth. Flayn.
In moments like this in Crimson Flower, gazing at Sirius is especially fitting. Just as the track has a very unsettling aesthetic, the player is also asking about what Rhea is referring to when she says things like, "Give me back my mother," especially if they haven't played the other routes yet. But as you might expect, the motif receives the most second half development during the Silver Snow route. After all, it's the route that focuses the most on Rhea. It receives development in Verdant Wind as well, but I'll focus mostly on Silver Snow, since most of the developmental moments in Verdant Wind line up with the ones in Silver Snow, though there is one Verdant Wind scene I'll mention that's not in Silver Snow. To my surprise, in Silver Snow I only noticed the Song of the Nabateans motif twice prior to saving Rhea from captivity. Once in Rhea's aforementioned paralogue, and the other time being after you defend the monastery from General Randolph, when Byleth, Sedith, and Flayn discuss the possible whereabouts of Rhea.
We have moved against the Empire with the intent of defeating them, but have not given up hope of recovering Rhea. If she is alive, we will find her. Rhea is like family to us, and to you as well. Please, lend me your strength.
Neither of those moments provide any real motivic development as far as I can tell, but they do serve the purpose of reminding the player of the central role of Rhea's character in Silver Snow, even if she isn't directly present just yet. Of course, once you do free Rhea, the original version of Song of the Nabateans returns in its full, unaltered form.
You have come to save me. Is this a dream? I have longed to see you again, all this time. Is it truly you?
Much like the scene after Byleth merges with Sothis, this iteration of the motif feels very intimate, what with the visual of Rhea and Byleth embracing amidst a bright white background and all. This scene also bears an interesting parallel with that scene in that Byleth and Rhea's roles are reversed. Byleth is now the one holding Rhea. Rhea's softer tone of voice also adds a layer of relief, having been freed from 5 years of imprisonment. Almost immediately afterward, Sedith asks Rhea about those who slither in the dark, and we jump back into gazing at Sirius as Rhea begins describing how they have long opposed the children of the goddess, and how they previously worked with Nemesis to eliminate them.
Since ancient times, I am sure you have heard the stories of a man named Nemesis.
Nemesis, the king of liberation.
Here, much like in White Clouds, the motif recalls mystery as we finally begin to learn about this organization we've caught glimpses of throughout the game. In Verdant Wind, though not in Silver Snow, the motif returns in similar fashion in a later scene at the monastery, where Rhea describes why the javelins of light that hit Fort Merceus never hit Garreg Mach.
I cannot afford to rest while Fodlan is in danger.
What do you mean when you say they couldn't drop a javelin of light here?
Once, a very long time ago, a massive ball of light fell upon this monastery.
In the following chapter, after you defeat those who slither in the dark once and for all, the motif plays when Rhea, as the Immaculate One, defends Byleth against the javelins of light sent by Talus. It's actually pretty easy to miss, as the explosions in the sky laser beams and the Immaculate laser beams dominate the soundscape, but this solemn statement of the motif accompanies the final time Rhea is able to control her power as the Immaculate One, before sustaining heavy injuries and being rushed back to the monastery. And then we get to the endgame. Unlike the Edge of Dawn, which reaches some sort of emotional closure at the end of all 4 routes, Song of the Nabateans never really comes full circle except for in Silver Snow, specifically in its endgame track, A Funeral of Flowers. And it makes sense. The motif that focuses entirely on Rhea's character is reserved for the route that focuses the most on her. But before I discuss that track in detail, I need to briefly remind you of the scene leading up to it, as it sets the tone for what is to come in the final battle. The scene begins in silence, but music plays once Rhea starts to describe Byleth's origin. Rhea then implores Byleth to use the goddess's power for good, but before she can finish her thought, Rhea suddenly devolves into a ravenous Immaculate One, and white beasts attack the monastery. The final battle begins, and Sedith describes the white beasts, and explains that he will have to take on the mantle of the children of the goddess in Rhea's absence. And thus, we get to A Funeral of Flowers. This track is the culmination of Rhea's character, and this culmination can be summed up like this. By clinging to the past, Rhea inadvertently brings about her own demise. I say demise, though it's pretty ambiguous as to whether or not Rhea canonically survives the end of Silver Snow. This tragedy is also reflected in the irony that your army, the very army that worked so hard to free Rhea, now has to put her down to prevent her from rampaging through Fodlan. And with that, let's talk about the actual music. I will be getting into some of the nitty-gritty on this one. The majority of the track feels very sweeping and very capital R romantic. The soundscape is very lush, and uses many classical compositional tricks such as suspension, appoggiatura, and hemiola to add emotional depth. For the musically uninitiated, I'll briefly translate. You often hear notes and musical figures in this track that are strategically placed in such a way as to not conventionally fit within the underlying chords or rhythmic structure, and this is often done to give off an emotional effect to the listener. I know that's rather vague, but that's the gist of it. But within this lush sound, the motif shows up twice in rather blunt fashion. First, in the soaring unison horn line, and the second immediately after in the sorrowful upper strings. The bluntness of these two iterations of the motif, in juxtaposition with the flowing nature of the rest of the track, serves as a very stark reminder of the tragedy of Rhea. The thunder version of A Funeral of Flowers also reinforces this tragedy, as it condenses the music to just the piano, as opposed to the thunder versions of other battle themes, which tend to ramp up the sound instead.
Vanish into the abyss! I will tear you down!
After the battle, when you defeat the Immaculate One, the motif returns in the wailing cutscene. Here, Byleth and Rhea maintain their reversed roles when the Immaculate One turns back into Rhea and Byleth catches her in the cathedral, recalling their prior moments of intimacy. Not only does Rhea return to herself, but she can also finally allow herself to put the past to rest.
You are here, Mother.
The ideas in this cutscene are followed up in Rhea's S support, and although we don't hear the Song of the Nabateans motif, the dialogue makes it clear that Rhea has finally learned her lesson, showing true remorse for all that she has done and resolving to support Byleth in creating a better world. Now, before we go on to our third motif, I'd like to zoom out and discuss some big picture things going on with our first two motifs. Just as the story portrays conflict between Edelgard and Rhea, so too do you hear their respective motifs in conflict. In fact, the Song of the Nabateans track from which the Song of the Nabateans motif comes, ironically includes a snippet of The Edge of Dawn, which goes to show just how pervasive The Edge of Dawn is throughout the game. Not even Rhea can receive her own theme without accounting for the presence of Edelgard. Both motifs are also present in Descent, the track that plays right before the time skip, as well as in Funeral of Flowers with similar effect. It's a very on-the-nose reflection of the ongoing tug-of-war of past versus future and gods versus humanity. And with that, we get to our third motif. This motif and the fourth one that we'll be discussing in a bit aren't used as much, but I thought I'd talk about them anyway. This is another motif introduced in the aforementioned Nintendo E3 trailer from 2018, but in-game we're introduced to the Spirit Deus when we first meet Sothis and customize Byleth. The motif instantly establishes a tone of mystery, Not only is Sothis asking Byleth about who they are and how they got there, but the player too is asking about who this girl is and what role she'll be playing. Even I, as a Fire Emblem veteran, couldn't quite figure it out at first, given that she doesn't immediately fit into the standard tropes of early Fire Emblem characters, i.e. your Jagans, Christmas Cavaliers, and so on. Throughout White Clouds, the Spirit Deist tends to appear in moments where Sothis is speaking to Byleth within their mind, and those conversations almost always involve Sothis trying to piece together who she is and why she and Byleth are connected. A few examples here are the conversations between Sothis and Byleth before the paralogging Xanadu, after returning the Lance of Ruin to the church, and after the battle in Ramire Village when Rhea shocks Byleth and Sothis by saying,
"May the goddess Sothis protect you."
The goddess Sothis? Is that what she just said?
Musically, the motif doesn't see too much development throughout the game. Kind of a bummer really, it's mostly just the Spirit Deist track over and over again. Fortunately for us though, the motif still has a couple of key moments where it actually does develop, 2 to be exact. One in White Clouds, and the other in Azure Moon and Crimson Flower. In White Clouds, specifically during the battle in the Sealed Forest, we experience the first moment of development via the track Awakening, at the end of the cutscene where Solon sends Byleth into the darkness of Zaharas. It is here that Sothis finally pieces together that she is the goddess that everyone has spoken of up to this point, and from there decides to merge her power with Byleth in order to escape the darkness and defeat Solon. The motif is a clear reflection of the power that comes from realizing one's identity.
So the Fellstar consumes even the darkness itself.
The second key moment of development is a rather interesting one. If I remember correctly, it's the only time the motif shows up in the second half of the game, aside from the scene where Sothis speaks to Byleth before they wake up after their 5-year slumber, and even then it only plays in Azure Moon and Crimson Flower. I am of course referring to the apex of the world, Azure Moon and Crimson Flower's endgame theme, and the motif's appearance in this track serves one clear purpose: to provide contrast with the Edge of Dawn. I used to think that it was lazy to reuse the apex of the world when Verdant Wind and Silver Snow each have their own endgame themes, but after thinking about it, I found that it actually makes total sense. Just as both routes cover the conflict between Edelgard and the Kingdom and Church, the apex of the world uses the Edge of Dawn and the Spirit Deist to widen the lens through which we see the conflict's conclusion. It showcases a juxtaposition between Edelgard and Dimitri, Rhea, and Sothis, humanity and deity, the concrete and the metaphysical, so on and so forth. In this sense, you cannot fully express one side of this conflict without the other, and the fact that the track loops also indicates that the conflict between them is cyclical. More on that in part 3, stay tuned. And since I don't have too much else to say about this motif, I'll just leave you with this. Despite its limited usage, the Spirit Deist still serves as an effective tool for both tying in and contrasting some of the key pieces of the story and conflict. Our fourth motif, in contrast with our first 3, doesn't address much as far as the plot goes, but rather displays some of the more meta aspects of the game. The Crest of Flames motif is clearly based on the main theme for the Fire Emblem franchise, as the Crest of Flames is this game's Fire Emblem.
Oh my gosh, you said the name of the thing!
Like the Edge of Dawn and the Spirit Deist, the Crest of Flames motif is first introduced in the 2018 Nintendo E3 trailer, but when playing the game, we hear it from the very moment we pull up the title screen, providing an obvious connection to the other games in the franchise that also use the motif in their respective title screens. In the story, we first encounter the motif right after you pick your house, when Hanneman calls Byleth into his office to talk about crests.
Is your calendar clear? This will take a while. Crests are a fascinating topic, but before one can dive deeply into said topic, one must first understand what crests are. They are power.
The mystical sound of the motif reflects the mystery of Byleth's crest, which isn't fully revealed until a few chapters later. Soon after, we hear a snippet of the motif in the cutscene on your first day as a professor when the bells ring. Of course, the same bells ring when you run out of activities on free days as well. The motif returns after you get the Sword of the Creator, and Hanneman tells Byleth that they bear the Crest of Flames, harkening back to the first conversation in his office about crests.
A crest thought to have disappeared from this world in the millennium since the fall of Nemesis, the King of Liberation. The Crest of Flames. That is what you possess.
It also appears in all three White Cloud's routes after the battle at Conan Tower. In the Golden Deer route, the motif plays as Sedith confiscates the book Claude was reading about the Immaculate One. In the Black Eagles route, it plays as Edelgard discusses Miklon's leadership ability and laments the emphasis people put on crests. And in the Blue Lions route, it plays as Dimitri discusses the Fargus nobility's obsession with crests and pines for reform. These appearances of the motif allow the player to think beyond the Crest of Flames itself, providing context for the larger debate on what role crests, and by extension the church and nobility, should play in Fodlan society. Now, if memory serves me correctly, this motif doesn't have much of a presence in the remaining sections of White Clouds or in the second half of the game, so I'll skip straight to the end, where the motif returns. While this statement of the motif doesn't serve any plot function, it does provide one last clear-cut connection to the rest of the series before the end credits take us home. And there we have our four main motifs and their respective developments. Is it as fancy or intricate as something like a Wagner opera or a John Williams score? No. But for this game, it doesn't need to. Even without some of the more learned techniques of the light motif, like inversion, retrograde, or, dare I say it, inverted retrograde. The developers and composers did a very effective job of using the music to portray the ideas of the story without having to spoon-feed everything to the players, and that's what's most important. Now, before we continue on to the next section, I'd like to bring back the 2018 Nintendo E3 trailer for a moment in order to illustrate one final thing about our four motifs. I want to show all of you just how efficiently Nintendo planted the seeds of all four motifs in our minds. Well, technically it's only 3 of them, but the spoken word by Rhea still covers the ideas of Song of the Nabateans, so I'm including it. Take a listen to how quickly they state the 4 motifs.
Long ago, the divine Seros received a revelation from the goddess, a gift to help guide the lost. Now, the goddess watches over Fodlan from her kingdom above as the mother of all life, the arbiter of every soul.
Such a brutal, irrational world we live in. Some believe the crests, tokens of the goddess's power, are necessary to maintain order. But they're wrong, teacher. The crests are to blame.
Reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. No, I wish I could stay here and cherish all.
Do you dare to walk this path with me? One misstep, and we fall to our ruin. So take your first step. It's now or never! I will return here someday, my teacher. Promise me that you won't forget me.
The trailer is barely 2 minutes long, but already it gets the ball rolling in our heads as to what to pay attention to in the game. Well played, Nintendo. Okay, now we're finally moving on. I'd like to discuss the 4 half motifs I alluded to earlier. These are musical figures that I felt had the potential to be motifs of their own, but never received the development that the 4 main motifs did. The first one that I'll highlight here is our first half motif has to do with those who slither in the dark. I suppose you could argue that this is actually a 5th full motif since it shows up numerous times in-game, more times in fact than the Crest of Flames and maybe even the Spirit Dais. But I'm putting it in the half motif category because those who slither in the dark aren't given a large enough story or plot role to allow substantial motivic development. Those who slither in the dark just kind of appear at various points of the story, and in turn, so too does the Those Who Sow Darkness half motif. A few examples of this include the death of Gerald at the hands of Monica/Krania, Solon removing Krania's crest stone and destroying it, Talus sending Byleth into the chasm before the time skip, and of course the music that plays while you're fighting in Shambhala. Again, not much development here. It just kind of appears whenever those who slither in the dark show up and do something. So we move on to our second half motif, which has to do with our self-insert. Given the central role of Byleth in Three Houses, you'd expect them to have a greater presence in this soundtrack. The heartbeat would be especially fitting, since Byleth spends their whole life without a heartbeat, except for when you beat Crimson Flower, of course. But despite not receiving much development, the heartbeat still shows up at crucial points in the plot, so at least you can't say they completely wasted it. One example that immediately comes to mind is in the Black Eagles route when Edelgard asks you to accompany her to Enbar, and the heartbeat appears as the game gives you your 2 choices. The same thing basically happens at the Holy Tomb when you have to decide whether or not to side with Edelgard. The heartbeat receives more obvious statements in Crimson Flower and Silver Snow, both in the scene where Byleth finally regains their heartbeat, and the scene where the heartbeat precedes Rhea's devolving to the rampaging Immaculate One, respectively.
I must ask you to use that power to save this world. You must... What? No! Ah!
Rhea? Rhea!
What is wrong? Please, calm yourself.
And of course, who could forget the heartbeat in the credits at the beginning of The Edge of Dawn?
In cherished halls, in peaceful days, I fear the edge of dawn, knowing time betrays.
But before going to our third half motif, I thought I'd address a few personal opinions on this soundtrack, since I've alluded to a few already. I figured I should go ahead and say some of them outright. Personally, I feel like The Edge of Dawn is the only motif in this game that receives adequate development. Song of the Nabateans comes close, but I wish they could have used it more, especially in the second half of the game. The Spirit Dais and the Crest of Flames definitely could have been developed a lot more too. Heck, more appearances of those motifs in general would have been nice. And obviously, Those Who Sow Darkness and the Heartbeat should have been full motifs in their own right. So what's the commonality between these opinions? More, more, more. I needed more development, more connections between music and story, more musical setup and payoff. Which leads me to my strongest and perhaps my most controversial opinion about this game's soundtrack. It has to do with our third half motif. And I can sense it. It's a track many of you have probably been waiting for me to talk about this whole video. A fan favorite, if you will. It's the most bombastic track in this game, and if it were a metal show, the vocalist would be calling on the fans to open up the pit. So what track is this? Well, it's... Okay, here's the deal. God-Shattering Star, it's literally this game's greatest missed opportunity. It's a banger, sure, but it comes out of nowhere. Literally, I went through the whole soundtrack, and aside from God-Shattering Star, I found only one other track that had any correlation to it, and it's at the beginning of the game in the scene at the Tiltine Plains where Seros is fighting Nemesis. And even that appearance is largely covered up by battle sound effects. In other words, once you get to God-Shattering Star, you've probably long since forgotten about it. You'd think, considering that Nemesis is supposed to be the real biggest baddie of this game, and since it was he that facilitated the creation of the Hero's Relics, and since it was because of him that Rhea had to cover up a lot of Fodlan's history with fabricated stories, that his would-be motif would be incorporated into the soundtrack more. But no, they just had to use it for 2 measly tracks. And it could have added so much more to the story. After all, members of Those Who Slither in the Dark already referred to Byleth as the Fell Star, since both Byleth and Nemesis used the Sword of the Creator. Additionally, Those Who Slither in the Dark implanted the Crest of Flames into Edelgard, much like they did to Nemesis before her, and this is paralleled by Rhea doing the same thing to Byleth. Why not lean into these things a bit more? It especially could have been used more in Verdant Wind, since, Nemesis is the final boss of that route. And all this isn't to say that everything in a video game soundtrack has to be motivic. It's just one of many ways to put a soundtrack together. In fact, you want to know what one of my favorite soundtracks of all time is? Sonic Adventure. And anyone who's played that game knows that that soundtrack isn't motivic whatsoever. It's just a collection of banger after banger after banger. Heck, even in Three Houses, there are plenty of great tracks that aren't motivically connected at all. Here's a list of all those tracks here. But you'd think that with a track as important as God-Shattering Star, they'd give it the same amount of attention they give to the other motifs, especially to the other endgame tracks, the Apex of the World and the Funeral of Flowers. And while we're on the topic of opinions, my only knock on God-Shattering Star, musically speaking, is that it falls into one of the traps I notice a lot of video game boss themes tend to fall into. It's got a little too much going on. What do I mean? While most tunes in this soundtrack, and much of the music that we know and love in general, focus on developing a small handful of musical ideas, God-Shattering Star just kind of piles one musical idea on top of another on top of another. Tracks like this easily become bloated in my opinion, even if each individual idea is cool in its own right. It doesn't make God-Shattering Star a bad track obviously, but it's something that's always just bugged me. Okay, where were we again? Oh right, our 4th half motif. Our 4th and final half motif comes from the DLC, so I won't go too in depth on it, since for one thing, the game doesn't, and for another, many of you may not have had a chance to play the DLC campaign. This half motif only shows up in 2 tracks, once in a battle theme, and the other in a dialogue track.
For once, your sharp tongue misses its mark. My elation is too powerful for your petty sniping to have any effect.
I suppose you could argue that the inverted Edge of Dawn motif could be the real motif of the Ashen Wolves, as it plays when you wander Abyss and when you fight the Cinder Shadow's final boss, but I just thought they could use a unique track to call their own. Unfortunately, I don't really have that much else to say about this one, so let's move on. Now, before we get to the last section of this video, I thought I'd mention another opportunity the developers could have taken on this soundtrack. Since Edelgard gets her own motif, I suspect that Dimitri and Claude were supposed to receive their own motifs as well, but they likely didn't have much room in the soundtrack to expand on them. Kind of a bummer. I would have liked to see what they could have done with those, but I can understand why they didn't. You only get so much room in a soundtrack to do so much. So we've been talking about the music for quite a while now, but I don't think the concept of the Light Motif is restricted to just the music. I would argue that it applies to the dialogue and plot as well. There's a constant juxtaposition of light and dark, deity and humanity, and so on. And I'm honestly surprised that no one has made a supercut of all the times someone says "by your side" throughout the game. I'll give a couple examples. I won't go into too much detail on these since plenty of other Fire Emblem YouTubers have discussed them better than I could, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about them at all. The most notable motif here is the concept of time. Time is a constant fixture in this story, from the beginning when Sothis offers to turn back the hands of time in your first battle against the bandits, and when Rhea asks herself if the flow of time brought Byleth to the academy, to Byleth merging with Sothis, to the time skip, and so much more. Among other things, this motif serves as a reminder to the player of the agency they hold over the story. Not only can the players choose a route, but they can even control time, at least to a certain extent. Likewise, trauma becomes a motif as we learn about events like the tragedy of Duscur, which severely damaged Dimitri's psyche, as well as Edelgard and Lysithea receiving second crests, and Rhea witnessing the slaughter of the children of the goddess. The development of this motif plays out in watching how each character responds to their own trauma. Dimitri develops a deep bloodlust toward Edelgard for her supposed involvement in Duscur. Edelgard channels her trauma into the war she wages to get rid of the gods and crests, and Rhea fabricates stories to cover up entire swaths of Fodlan's history. Related to trauma, the horror of war also becomes a motif. In the second half of the game, regardless of route, Byleth ends up having to kill former students, as do the students of your army. This motif features most prominently in the second battle at Gronder Field, where students from all three houses reunite to kill one another, with many students losing their lives. Similarly, in Azure Moon and Crimson Flower, Dimitri and Edelgard are forced to kill each other, despite having fond memories of the time they spent together as children. Conversely, cooperation and friendship also become motifs. Again, the buyer's side phrase that constantly appears is a clear portrayal of this. Additionally, the three house leaders can only succeed in their goals with the help of Byleth, i.e., you. The other two either end up dying or disappearing depending on route. Not only does this give the player a sense of importance given the role of Byleth as the self-insert, but it also reinforces the idea that one's goals can only be achieved with the help of others. Reach for my hand, and all that. Mystery also features prominently as a motif. After all, I've already used the term mystery countless times in this video. Throughout the game, the player is encouraged to question nearly everything that this game presents. Who is Sothis? What is Byleth's backstory? What are the forces behind the events in White Clouds? So on and so forth. Of course, there are undoubtedly other motifs I'm forgetting, but I should probably go ahead and wrap this video up. I've been talking quite long enough. I'll continue all this in the third and final part of this essay, where I'll be discussing how Three Houses fits into the overall meta of the Fire Emblem franchise. I'll also include an addendum to this video. I realized part of the way through making this video that there's an entire section I just completely forgot to write in, and while it's something I think is worth discussing, it's not so crucial that I have to go back and redo entire swaths of this video for it. So I'll include it in part 3, and hopefully part 3 won't take nearly as long to put together as part 2 did. Stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.